This is an audio presentation which I go over some of the main topics and themes that really shaped Canada's history in the novel and in real life. And this is really just some sort of comparisons between the novel and history and modern day, as well as how the author, Margaret Atwood, incorporated these elements in order to create the novel and how it had an effect on the overall plot and characters as well. So, one of the main themes and really focuses in the novel was women, and specifically women in the 1800s, how they were treated, how they acted, how they presented themselves, and what this meant for the plot and the story of the Elias Grace. Um, so in this during this era, women mostly they had a role to play, which was sort of like they were acting. And this was because many of the things which their male counterparts could do, they really couldn't do because of the social restrictions that were placed upon them during this period. They were expected to do certain things, different things that really embodied this certain stereotype that many women during this era were following all the protocols, and such could be seen as Grace Marks, one of the main protagonists and characters in the story. She learned and found the strange ways and practices of women and their during this era to be kind of strange. One such example of the really widely viewed that had driven the plot as one of the main reasons why Grace had survived and lived was because she was simply a woman. And this can be seen as Mr. McDermott, who was a fellow male conspirator in this crime. He was immediately hanged, and one of the things which the jurors and the lawyers and everyone around the general people and public during this era, they really couldn't believe that a young woman could be responsible for such a crime. And this was the main defense that her lawyer had used in defending her case, as well as how many of the lobbyers and protesters had made when they were trying to release her from prison. The only act and the only portrayal of Grace that many refused to see, other than what she may or may have not done, instead of a suspect, was just a poor, lonely young woman who was accused of a crime that really was not capable of women being able to do, which during now, if we were to compare this to the modern times, it is obviously it's false. If you did a crime, you committed the crime. It doesn't matter who or like what you were. And these stereotypes and really these restrictions and these basically acts that were portrayed during this period really helped drive the plot, and it shaped who our character is and exactly the experiences that she received during this era as well. Atwood, however, Margaret Atwood, the author of this novel, she really didn't portray herself in the writing as Grace as really a feeble, simple minded woman. Instead, Grace Marks, if you read her dialogue and her inner thoughts, it can obviously be determined that she is hiding something, she's manipulative, and there's something going on that really readers as a reader it is really dire to know, but we currently don't know whether she had actually committed the crime or not. For evidence, I would like to quote Simon Jordan, Dr. Simon Jordan, who was trying to help Grace receive her memories back. One of the things which Jordan says is that for the widely held view that women are weak spined and jelly like by nature, and would slump to the floor like melted cheese if not roped in, he has nothing but contempt. While a medical student, he dissected a good many women, from the laboring classes, naturally, and their spines and musculature were on average no feebler than those of men, although many suffered from rickets. Atwood 73. Dr. Jordan was one of the few people during this time that, even though he held many of these perceptions and these class roles and ideals of women. He really knew the truth was that there was a high possibility that Grace might have actually murdered Nancy Montgomery and Thomas Kinnear. Another quote which shows the status of women during this era and in Elias Grace is another quote by Simon, of course. He says, "It was knowledge women craved, yet they could not admit to craving it, because it was forbidden knowledge, knowledge with a lurid glare to it, knowledge gained through a descent into the pit. He had been where they could never go, seen where they never see. He has opened up women's bodies and peered inside. In his head, which has raised his own hands towards his lips, he may have held a beating female heart." Dr. Jordan's candid approach to all issues was really based on his medical training and what he knew from the facts. Dr. Jordan knew that women really wanted and they had the capability, of course, obviously, to do whatever they want, but he knew that due to the social restrictions, the themes, and really the entire stereotypes that were greatly embedded in the history and in many of these people, he knew that it was not a possibility for them. In our current era, women can do anything that they really want to do as long as it's abiding by the law. And of course, women are recognized as equal to men, and many of these has changed due to history and really the realization that there really is not that much of a difference. Now women can vote, have a voice. They can either decide to work or stay at home. Many of these things which we take for granted was not possible for Grace Marks or the other women in this story as well. Another important theme in the novel is really just mental health and the question of sanity. Throughout the novel, really, you can tell the way mental health patients or treatments, or in general, the stigma of mental health was really at an all time high during this period. Unlike today, many people who suffered mental health were often shunned out of their society or taken to these ridiculous and really scary mental health institutions, which instead of helping a person to feel better, they would really make you come out much, much worse. And one of the common issues for many of these institutions was that many of the guards, doctors, and workers would abuse the patients, and they would make them humiliate themselves. They would not give them enough food. They really weren't taking care of them at all, and it was more like a money or business thing. This can be best seen in the novel as the main character, Grace Marks. She is shortly taken to an insanity hospital, and what happens there is that she really gets traumatized and tormented during her brief stay there. One of the main doctors, Dr. Bernard, in particular, had really driven her fear of doctors, and the outside world, outside of these insanity hospitals, really did not care too much, and mental health patients were normally treated as really pets or an abnormal thing or not even a human being anymore, as they were closely studied, experimented on, and really tested on. Thus, this is really different from the modern Canada and today, and Atwood really paints a picture of the struggles that these people with mental health issues would had faced during this era and the stigmas that were surrounding within as well. One thing which Grace says is that when you are in the middle of a story, it isn't a story at all, but only a confusion, a dark roaring, a blindness, a wreckage of shattered glass and splintered wood, like a house in a whirlwind, or else a boat crushed by the icebergs, or swept over the rapids and all aboard the powerless to stop it. It's only afterwards that it becomes anything like a story at all, when you are telling it to yourself or to someone else. Thus, Grace Marks, she really had experienced some inner trauma and inner mental health issues throughout her life due to the occurrences, her treatments, how she was being treated. And as she's telling her story, she goes through different stages within her as she is relieving all of the stress and trauma to Dr. Simon Jordan. Another issue in this novel as well was that Grace Marks had was later revealed to have a split personality. And what this meant was that she had indeed murdered she had indeed murdered Thomas Kinnear and Nancy Montgomery, but it was under Mary Whitney who had quote unquote possessed her, as many of the people had believed in the novel. Of course, this is most likely to be a syndrome of split personality that Grace had suffered from, and this was due to her traumatic loss of her best friend. And what she did was to relieve it was that as she felt what her friend would really take over her, and she would begin acting completely like her friend and thus doing stuff that Mary Whitney would do, but Grace Marks certainly would never do. And overall, the treatments of mental health, the issue of mental health, and the stance between truth, false, and whatever is in between really is one of the main factors that drives the plots as well. And it's something that Margaret Atwood had really experimented on, and she really put it out the suffering and the pain that many of these people in the novel were going through, both Grace Marks and some of the other mental health patients in the asylum as well. Of course, moving on, I will be talking briefly of some other factors that played a role in the novel as well and were present in Canada's history in the novel, and how Margaret Atwood had developed it to fit in both these elements. Another main theme that was present in the novel what was really the justice system during this era, and this played out a lot as mentioned earlier. Grace Mark's status as a woman and really her demeanor and the way she portrayed herself really made the justice system was unreliable already from the start of this entire era, and most judges were either biased or the rulings were passed based on really not enough evidence, or in the trial system and the justice system was really not even valid or coherent at all. An example of this might be that for the trial of Thomas Kinnear, Grace Mark's old employer who had been murdered, he was given a trial, but Nancy Montgomery, his housekeeper, who was also brutally murdered at the same time, and they were found together, was not given a trial. And this is something that really the judge had just ruled it was abundant or it would use too much resources. But in, let's say, our modern era, any crime would be tried upon and the defendants would have an opportunity to defend themselves. Another example would be that James McDermott, who was convicted of possibly killing Nancy Montgomery and Thomas Kinnear along with Grace, he was not even given a proper trial at all, and he was immediately sentenced to hanging. This is due to the fact, most likely, that he was a man and was most likely, in their view, was most likely to be the one who was perpetrating it. And Grace Marks, even though she may or may not have played a hand in the murder, many of the jury and the judges had most likely believed that it was James McDermott's influence, or he had convinced her somehow to be able to help him with the crime. Thus, really, it was not at all reliable, and unlike today, as I mentioned before, Margaret Atwood really played out this injustice and the entire system to drive the plot and the truth and search for the truth, and who had murdered who and what had really happened was based upon the justice system's ability to find anything out, which they really did not try. Two, they immediately had in invicted they immediately incarcerated Grace Marks, and they had immediately hanged James McDermott without proper reasoning or really structures other than the fact that these were what was mostly happening during this era as well. Moving on to another aspect of Canada and really our rights that we have today that really wasn't present in the novel and Margaret Atwood's picture of Canada. Margaret Atwood's picture of Canada and her descriptions, illustrations was mostly based on what was actually happened during the actual 1800s era and the 19th century. Many of the elements and aspects, such as journalism, social standings, women's treatments, justice, mental health, all of these issues are expounded upon based on what had happened in real life in Canada and what had changed and now evolved into what we take advantage of in this modern era. We don't need to really worry about many of these problems as many of the people would have in this time frame. And another important aspect as well in the novel was the journalism and the search for truth and finding out what had really happened. This is a brief slide, but as you can most likely tell in the novel and really based on history as well, many of the facts were based upon the stereotypes, what people thought would, what the reporters thought would happen, and it was most of the news that was provided was categorized as news, but really it was all just opinion pieces and propaganda that each different reporter or community wanted to hear. Such an example could be in Grace Marks and really the way she describes the way the journalists were going after her and calling her a murderess as a celebrated murderess. You could clearly tell that this was more of an interesting drama to the town than really an actual murder case. Many of the newspapers really did not take her seriously as a suspect or a crime, and really they romanticized the notion of being a murderess and murdering people um, in favor of what they believed and what they really thought had happened as well. And many of the facts which had happened, and Grace remarks that if you had read the newspapers and you had seen her, it's really completely different to what had actual happened, the actual events that occurred. So I'm just going to move on here and I'm going to go to the end of the slide. Of course, the author of the story, Margaret Atwood, and if you're writing a novel, many of the settings and the stories, you're free to make them up. However, Atwood had closely described and illustrated, narrated, and painted a picture for readers of Canada that really resembled, as I mentioned before, what had actually happened, the themes, and really that these things they shape Canada's history, and if one could really look back at it, you could really tell that there of course has been drastic changes and there's really different things that people were struggling with in this time frame versus what people are struggling with now. One of the main reasons which Margaret Atwood would have written about Canada in the story and really expounded upon based in the story and the characters and what had occurred was because Margaret Atwood herself is Canadian and she grew up relatively in Ontario as well, and she set up her novel to be based in Ontario, and it was based on a true case that she was interested in at a very young age as well. Furthermore, Margaret Atwood's development of the resolution and the conclusion and the overall story, plot, and themes were greatly enriched and driven by the history and the facts that were presented in the novel. An example would be that after every couple of chapters, she would insert an excerpt of a newspaper article, an actual newspaper article that was written during this time, or some other authors' thoughts and reflections on the events that had occurred. A presence that, of course, made for an excellent novel that was really plentiful, and it was really an exciting thing to learn about and to for readers to try and figure out what had actually happened. The ending of the novel, of course, as you can tell that it really is influenced and historical fiction, is that Margaret Atwood, she felt free to basically adds what she thought would be the ending, and she encouraged readers to do the same thing because the case of Grace Marks in reality, in real life, that had actually happened was not closed. She was finally released from prison 29 years later, but she had disappeared, making this a mystery that was really prominent. And of course, we're talking about this until today, so it was really fascinating to go through and experience this ride in history as well. And the way that she portrayed the novel was interesting, as it was a mix of facts, fiction, and so many different morals, themes, settings that were all entwined into one. This is an end of my audio presentation. Thanks.